Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have everyone online today. Today, we're going to be hosting Investors' Point of View and discussing the impact of generative AI on the future of SaaS. My name is Deanna Uzarski, and I am on the marketing team. And we're going to go ahead and move forward with just a few quick housekeeping items. So first, this is going to be recorded. So if you need to leave early, you need to step out for a minute, no worries. We're going to be able to send the recording link to you following the webinar. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox. Second thing is, if you have questions, please let us know. We want to make this interactive. We want to hear what you guys have to say. We know you also submitted some in advance, so we're going to be addressing a lot of those today as well. So please chat those in to us. And finally, we will be hosting a 2-question survey following this. So please take a second to answer. It helps make sure that we're giving you guys the best content possible, and we really appreciate the feedback. One last item before I hand it over to our moderator. We are very excited to announce that we will be hosting Scale Up AI again this year. If you weren't able to join last year, this is our AI-focused industry conference that's going to be on October 26th. For more information, check out scaleup.events. That has a lot of information from what we did last year, but keep checking back there. Follow us on social media, and we will be announcing speakers, sessions soon, and we're extremely excited. So more info to come on that. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jenna.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here today and have the opportunity to discuss how we at Insight really see the impact of generative AI on software. And so to introduce myself first, I'm Jenna Zerker, and I'm a VP here at Insight. I focus mostly on AI, data, and infrastructure investing, and will be moderating the panel today. To kick it off, if you aren't as familiar with Insight, we've been investing in software for over 25 years and are now partners to over 600 transformative companies and have 20 billion under management. And so with that, have the flexibility to really invest in software operators across every stage. So we want to take and leverage that experience in software investing across small and large enterprises and share how, as a result, we really see generative AI transforming the future of software today. We have invested in AI for countless years, but the recent innovation in AI has led us to believe that we are really at this huge platform shift. We actually did a poll just last week to kind of test this. And, we recently just released it, and it showed that almost 40% of people in our network are already using generative AI often. And so clearly it's making an impact on how people live and work. So today in the conversation, we'll structure it into 2 parts. Firstly, we'll discuss a few key questions or areas of discussion that we think are really critical to understanding the impact of generative AI. And then we'll open up to questions from all of you that were submitted either kind of before this panel or live today. And so with that, I'm very lucky to have the pleasure of introducing our 2 panelists, George and Ganesh. Firstly, George is an MD here at Insight focused on AI, ML, and data companies. And before Insight, he spent over 20 years bringing AI and ML products to market as the CEO of Kespri, the president and COO of Alteryx, and in leadership roles at SAP and Salesforce. And secondly, we have Ganesh, who is also an MD at Insight focused on AI, data, and applied AI companies. And he is a former entrepreneur and operator across startups, scale-ups, and public companies, and really brings over 25 years of company building experience and deep expertise in enterprise software. Before Insight, he ran Uptake, an AI and ML platform and applications company, and held leadership roles at GE, SAP, and Salesforce. So thank you both for being here and sharing your wealth of experience and perspective. And so I think, with that, it's time to kind of kick off our key questions. And I guess I'll start it with George. Insight and you have been investing in AI for countless years. Like, why now? What is so exciting and new about the innovation that we're seeing today?
So thanks, Jenna, and appreciate this kickoff. One of the things that I will say for anyone who's interested in this space right now is that it's not just this moment that's happened these last few weeks or last few months. This has been a buildup that's been occurring for quite a few years. So I would almost think about this first and foremost as the emergence of what are 3 interrelated hyperstacks. when you think about the bottom layer of that hyperstack, it's certainly been the growth of the modern data stack itself, right? The confluence of petabyte scale information now reaching private data sources and being able to coalesce that in a scale where you're now starting to see the cloud native data warehouses, the Snowflakes, the Databricks, the BigQueries of the world really taking on the need to handle data management at scale for most of the enterprises. And of course, the tooling that surrounds the modern data stack. Secondarily, we started to see a few years ago the emergence of machine learning operations. And the reason why machine learning operations was significant is that you needed a tool chain to be able to enable yourself to build models at scale. And so one of the investments that we had made at Insight a few years back was weights and biases, which became one of the centralized tools for how you do experiment tracking, hyperparameter tuning, version controls. And there was an entire capability set around the entirety of the MLOps stack itself, or I would say more of a tool chain than a stack. And then more recently, we're now seeing this emergence of generative AI applications. And certainly with the emergence of Jasper and other companies that are now building these naturally oriented experiences for how generative AI can be able to take a real interesting and compelling persona like a content marketer and transform how they work. That's where we see a tremendous amount of opportunity. All of this is happening because of a fundamental innovation around the models themselves, which are basically known as transformers, and the scale that we can now bring a tremendous amount of data and build transformers that are now at the scale where we're seeing a 1 trillion parameter large language model. The benefit of that is that you can build incredible applications with a large language model, a foundation model at the center of it. And that acceleration, Jenna, has happened in, I would say, the last 6 months to a year. And we're tremendously excited to be serving founders that are building capability across these hyperstacks.
And I would add to it, like, one of the things that as George clearly articulated, the big technology shifts that we're seeing, right? But it's also a massive architectural and programming model shift to the tune of like what we've seen with cloud and mobile, but it's a much wider application and use case area. And the second is that this is also a moment where we have, if you look at the short history of enterprise software, the huge amount of install base and the legacy that's out there. Some of the biggest enterprise software companies are about 25 years old in architecture patterns, and a lot of that can be fundamentally reimagined right now. And the third big thing that we see why the moment is very interesting is the last decade of what we call digital transformation, or industries and businesses getting reimagined in software and data. And now this AI transformation means we're not only automate industries, we're going to build intelligent industries. So this combination of architecture, programming model shift, the state of install base, that is where the market is, and also where we are in the digital transformation or the AI transformation of industries makes it a super compelling and seminal moment in the history of software.
It's interesting. You both spoke to kind of the core innovation in the underlying technology. And I think one thing we've seen with that is, unlike maybe historical kind of the innovation around software, it's really easy to actually spin up a generative AI application today. And so I'm curious, with that, we've seen kind of this flurry of founders into the generative AI space. How do you think about what creates durability, whether that's identifying an opportunity where there's kind of durable value long term, or kind of evaluating a company and considering, is this a durable company?
Yeah, so we're definitely living in an age of hyper innovation and experimentation. And George, I don't know about you, there's never been a technological shift where it's put so many researchers out of the labs into being entrepreneurs for the very, very first time, right? And so when we look at this, I mean, obviously all the things that we traditionally apply in investing applies, but I tend to think of three things. One is the team itself, because now that we have so many researchers out there building products, we actually want to see teams that can actually transition from this research to actually building commercial products, right? And that means that it's not just deep researchers, but also people that are surrounding themselves with expertise of go-to-market and being able to productize these capabilities. And the second is the categories themselves. And we'll talk a little bit about the opportunities we see both in the emergence of this new stack, just like what George talked about in the industrialization of MLOps, we saw a birth of new categories, lots of different micro segments. Same thing's going to happen in this generative AI stack. There's a very simplistic view out there of, there's foundation models and applications that are being built on top, but I think it's going to be a lot more nuanced than that. History has taught us that, there's never been an organically assembled full stack software company. So there's going to be new layers because people often underestimate the layers above them or below them. So there's opportunities just within the new stack. And then when you apply them to other enterprise application categories, be it in areas where there are large incumbents, like I mentioned, sometimes with 25-year-old architectures that can be fundamentally reimagined, right? And the third thing that we look for is kind of like the approach. It is possible to build defensible moat in a shadow or derivatives of the foundation models that are out there, right? Initially, it may be a simplistic wrapper, but over time, the right entrepreneurs focus on not just the user experience, but all the data around the user experience, the workflow, all the data around the workflow experience, as well as like proprietary data in a particular domain, so they can actually build like domain-based business models. So when we look at this team category and the combination of approach, we do believe there are durable companies to be built in this age of generative AI, because in the foundation models game, it's definitely not a winner take all. We're seeing so many different approaches, and we're still super early in the days of what does it mean to actually build on top of a foundation model.
Yeah, and to emphasize that last point that Ganesh made, this is a moment for builders to build. I can't push that agenda for anyone listening at this moment in time. If you think about what the builders should be focused on building, there's a tremendous amount that's already underway in terms of the original and important research surrounding the build out of these foundation models at scale, as Ganesh indicated. What comes next after that moment is the taking of private data, like the extraction of that private data, and being able to deliver a domain-specific model and offering what a compelling user experience and workflow is offered to the market as almost a persona-driven experience now. That is fundamentally how software was built for many years. What's different now is you need to have that expertise when it comes to how you manage private data, and certainly how you take a foundation model and fine-tune it or domain specify it for your specific persona.
And so I guess, given how you think about what creates a durable kind of opportunity, I'm curious, George, like what areas are you most excited about? Whether that's as you think about the stack and going from application all the way down to foundation model, or as you think about kind of the application layer and thinking about vertical to horizontal opportunities.
So I alluded to a few things, Jenna, that we are pretty excited by from a durability perspective. And again, all of this is happening in an accelerated pace where we think this is all going right now could even change remarkably in the next week or two, right? It feels like the pace of innovation is that fast. But from what we know today, what we can see is on the application layer, being able to take workflow plus UX, a domain specified model, and private data matters quite a bit, and really understanding how to turbocharge a persona. I mean, the reason why Jasper has done incredibly well up to this point is that they've really understood the persona of a content marketer themselves and built what I almost think of as a mech suit around that content marketer. And so anyone who's in the application space has to take a similar viewpoint to how they own that domain and persona effectively. If you work your way down into, say, for instance, the MLOps layer, and where does the tools effectively matter, what you really have to think through as a potential builder in the tools arena is how much space is currently occupied by the current delivery providers from an MLOps tooling standpoint, and what could you do that's more focused on LLM, right? Just what's more focused on foundation model building, and where are there some potential white spaces? So we're still big investors in the tools surrounding the build out of more machine learning models and more foundation models at scale. So we're continuing to look for additional opportunities besides the big investments that we've made in the last 2 years. And then when you go into the foundation model itself, we think that there's going to be some durability in a few providers building, the foundation models that are at scale today and continue to be at scale, and OpenAI being a very obvious one. But there's also another end of the extreme where we think there's an opportunity, which is how do you get foundation models more compacted, more focused and targeted for a specific domain. And so in this regard, we're actually seeing companies now that are building small form factor large language models that can be deployed on endpoints, on devices, on IoT infrastructure, on laptops. And that's pretty exciting too, right? Because there's an opportunity to think about all these disconnected places that software exists, that an LLM could be the beating center of those markets. And so if you kind of work from stack to tool to infrastructure, we definitely see more opportunities continuing to emerge from an investment standpoint.
Yeah, I think the innovation, even the foundation models, like George mentioned, while like compactness is one aspect, we're obviously seeing some open source alternatives as well, and that also makes the models more steerable, more understandable, more alignable, because those are some of the big areas of research. So if you refer back to the article that we have on our website on what we call the new stack, there's clearly innovation that's happening in the foundation model. Like we said, there's some interesting ideas, and there's going to be a lot of domain-based models. We still think that, Bloomberg's a great example of releasing a domain-based model where an incumbent has just as much as opportunity as a startup to go use their unique access of data or domain knowledge or codify their IP into these kind of new intelligent models, right? And anybody that has access to that kind of data can do that in medicine or in insurance or real estate or so many different industries where there's going to be new control points, and these new control points are defined by these domain-based models. And on the build layer, like George talked about, yes, the MLOps tooling layer is going to expand, but we also see new categories, like we pointed out in our market map, especially around alignment, especially around safety and steerability and observability of all of these models. And in the application layer, oh my God, we can spend a whole hour. You can look at it by existing categories of applications that are out there that can be reimagined, or you can look at patterns, right? Applications around unstructured data, or applications that support this archetype of a co-pilot model, or applications that unlock more human reasoning, or applications that automate more human reasoning. So there's so many different categories of applications. And then when you apply it through vertical lens, I think especially vertical software is going to be very, very interesting. We saw the last decade vertical SaaS becoming super interesting because of this closed loop innovation with deep relationship with customers, and everything from your company, from go-to-market, tends to be tuned just to that particular vertical, right? So you don't have to build vanilla and sprinkle gummy bears and call it a vertical. You can go really, really deep. And we're going to see that amplified by generative AI and AI in general.
Ganesh, there was actually a question on the chat that Rob Bailey, a friend of Insights, kind of asked, particularly on that, where do you potentially see some of those specific vertical use cases that are super exciting to you today?
Healthcare is going to be an interesting one because we've already seen people that can take, we're seeing bits and pieces of this. We haven't seen people assemble into an application. Like we've seen companies that can take unstructured care notes and create structured data out of them. So people that can build intelligent models. Supply chain is going to be an interesting one, where applications that require a lot of planning and simulation will be the interesting area for generative AI. So yeah, there's so many application areas.
And similarly, a question came in that is super relevant as we talk about kind of opportunities within the stack. Someone asked, just curious, as you think about kind of the modern data stack, George, that you spoke to, and MLOps, it feels like, or the question is training models really becoming, not necessary? With the fact, with GPT-4 and with kind of these large foundation models, how does that impact like MLOps solutions that are helping with training models?
Yeah, it's a really important question that was asked, and just to repeat the question and help answer it. the question is like, how much more significance is there to just training data, right? And the effort to bring training data into the generative AI world. We think it is still important. However, it's different, right? So in the models that we're talking about, particularly for generative AI, what's known as the transformer-based architecture, these are auto-recursive, single-shot, few-shot models. So what changes, Jenna, at that point is that this supervised deep learning structure where you're feeding in gobs of very, sort of cleansed, organized data from a training data standpoint changes, right? You're actually feeding in larger, perhaps, sets of semi-structured, unstructured data, and the models themselves have some capability of really being able to parse those out. So that's one big thing that changes. The second thing that changes pretty dramatically is the use of what comes out of the model from an inference standpoint. So one of the most compelling things that we've seen, particularly with ChatGPT and some of the work that's been done in some of these generative architectures, is that the inference that comes out is then looped back in to improve model performance. And so one technique around that is known as reinforcement learning, and specifically reinforcement learning that has human feedback loops. So how are these models getting more aligned and being able to serve us as humanity better, particularly in the last month or two, than we've ever seen before? Well, it turns out that it is the fact that the models have gotten better, the data is being pushed in at scale, and this human in the loop based approach to reinforcement learning is aligning these models better than we've ever seen before. I mean, look at the dramatic difference of what's happened with GPT 3.5, ChatGPT, aka, versus where we are with GPT-4, right? Far more aligned, far more sort of exacting in terms of giving the answers that are necessary back to the folks that are asking the question and building the parameters associated with it, as well as kind of building the prompts. So that kind of gives you an idea of where we're headed today, which is probably a little bit different from what we've historically seen around supervised.
Awesome. So, I mean, I guess with that, as we talked a lot about kind of where the opportunities are in terms of builders who are building in generative AI, and as we think about where we're investing, I guess on the other side of things, we're software investors and we've been supporting software operators for years. There's a lot of software operators who have been building their company and are creating significant disruption within their respective industries for the last number of years. And generative AI has now come up and been, a completely new level and scale of kind of innovation and opportunity that they can either capitalize on or that could actually be a risk to their own business. So I'm curious, Ganesh, for software founders who have been building without generative AI for years, like what advice do you have for them as it relates to considering whether to leverage this technology and or kind of protect their current core business?
Yeah, it's a phenomenal time to be a entrepreneur or a founder because of all of the things, not just what generative AI offers in terms of optionality, in terms of your product strategy, but also what it does to your core software development. The whole art of software development has changed, right? What was it, about 15 years ago, Mark Anderson wrote "Software Eats the World," and I think it was a few years ago we started people saying AI eating software, and it's actually happening, where text is becoming a alternative to programming, where we're seeing text to Python, to text to SQL, to text to actually building an application, or even a snapshot of an application, hand-drawn sketch to be turned into a full-blown application. So step one is, first of all, are you actually using generative AI in your own core software engineering? That would be one of the things that we want to know. If you're an entrepreneur, we always ask that question, how people are thinking about that. And pretty much every developer is becoming a 10x developer. We've known these kind of developers, and they're called 10x not because they write 10x the amount of code, because they write code that works the very first time. There's an architecture and design and intentionality about the design that other people can code around. And also when they build code, it's resilient and you don't have to refactor them. Now with generative AI, we're seeing systems already where people are able to build code, immediately catch errors, refactor and the code gets rewritten in real time. And so step one, are you actually using generative AI to build your software engineering discipline and your software? That's one thing. The second is we're actually asking all entrepreneurs to think about how does this help you play offense or defense? And we talked a little bit about we've invested a lot in MLOps. Does it allow for a moment of certain categories to be reimagined? So George, one of the categories I know it came up is core BI, right? We've seen 3 generations of BI come in and go. It does feel like this is a moment to reimagine BI.
Yeah, and when you think about these reimaginations, what's really fascinating to now see, Ganesh and Jenna, is that it's not only the entrepreneur that's doing something disruptive that can take advantage of this opportunity. It's just as much the incumbent who has ownership of tremendous amount of workflow, a tremendous amount of private data. They can come in and disrupt an entire market themselves. And so what we look at today is where those opportunities are just as much for the incumbents to win more in their respective space as it is for a new upstart to come in and reimagine their category.
And that again is also a market opportunity, right? If you're an entrepreneur, you can build tooling. Like one of the things that's happened in the last, I would want to say about 6 or 7 years of cloud and big data is technology companies building technologies for other tech companies, other digital natives. Now, there are a lot of incumbents. There are very few companies, maybe like Bloomberg, that can actually have deep internal research teams put out a large language model that's focused on finance. Now, can you be the software company that actually enables these non-digital natives, if you will, to build and take their first steps in generative AI? Can you make these models more accessible? Can you make the programming model more consumable? And that also is another opportunity. So we think about companies that are building, I call it platformers for the non-1%ers of the world. How do you truly democratize this area of new breakthroughs by helping people build new kinds of applications?
It's so interesting because one of the big questions that we got was around actually, I'm a software company. How do I leverage generative AI either for internal efficiency improvements or for improving external customer experience? So, given that you both work with many software companies, are there examples of ways that the software companies you've worked with have leveraged generative AI for kind of the benefit of them, whether that's for internal efficiency reasons or for external kind of revenue driving purposes? Or, how would you go about, if not, like, how would you go about thinking about whether or not you can?
Yeah, I'll give 2 examples. One of just efficiency, and this is one that a number of software companies that we know are taking advantage of. And then the other is I'll give an example of what's been completely unique and new that you can do with a generative AI use case that you couldn't do before. So the example on efficiency, Ganesh alluded to it. If you look at what's happening with GitHub Copilot, it's a profoundly different experience to take a new project on from a software standpoint than it's ever been in the history of software. And the reason that is that if you were building something new or building something extending of what's already in a software foundation, the amount of help, the amount of co-piloting, the amount of just tools that are increasing your productivity at scale. And it's not just the folks that are, the early programmers that can have, the help from a tooling standpoint to take advantage of a co-pilot. I think Ganesh mentioned this. The 10Xers are, 2 to 3 times more productive now, even with the use of Copilot. And that's a pretty compelling thing to see, right? Just that anyone who's been a software professional up to this point can find tremendous amount of scale in terms of how they work. And that's going to happen and permeate all of software development, period. I think what's exciting to also see is some of the new use cases that have emerged. So we invested into a company in Israel called DeepDub. And what was compelling to see what they have done with generative AI is they provide a new layer for synthetic dubbing services. And the idea there is that if Squid Games comes out in Korean, how do you transliterate that, getting the tonality, getting the voice, getting everything right to be able to turn a Korean language film into 40 languages dubbed almost near instantaneously, right? And so suddenly you're introducing a new level of not only productivity, but optionality in terms of how global distribution of the entire film category can reemerge because of how easy you can bring a language that is not as much spoken around the world and transliterate that to 40 plus languages near instantaneously. And so those opportunities of like creating a new form of either the way you work or a new entire approach to a business is happening day in, day out, as we're seeing some of these new generative examples emerge.
I read, Jenna, one of the questions that came up, maybe comment on it and ask George to comment on as well, is regarding the cost of training these models and how does it become accessible for most to be able to train, so it is not just the domain of the super giant hyperscalers who have vast amount of compute. And that's happening in two vectors, right? One is, we talked about, yes, models are getting increasingly complex, but increasingly you're seeing a next iteration of a model with less parameters. So it doesn't need the 1 trillion parameters. Can you actually build it in 50 billion parameters, or can you build it in 7 billion parameters and make them perform just as well, or get to 95% of human acceptance, or a threshold where it's good enough? And we're seeing the same thing happen in models that are becoming even more compact in terms of physical size, in terms of the data that is needed to actually train. So the training runs, we've seen comparisons of where training a GPT 3.5 or 4 required months, versus now compact models that are taking hours to go train. Again, they're not going to perform just as well as GPT 3.5 or 4 across a wide range of use cases, but in certain contained use cases, they could be just as well good enough.
Yeah, and I think when we look at the options in terms of where things are going to go from a generative standpoint, the compactness of models and the ability to just retrain and focus and target on highly tuned, highly pruned models is something that we're seeing day in, day out. The other area that we should also keep in mind is the inference costs right now seem a lot higher than they likely will be over time, right? Because right now there's a limitation on how many GPUs are available, right? And so we're seeing generally high inference costs. I think there was some comment that was made that the cost of a query for ChatGPT in particular is about 10 cents, and that is quite expensive, right? Considering how many queries and output that are being answered by ChatGPT today. So we do believe that inference cost is also going to go down. And why is that? Because there's just going to be more domain-specific AI chips. There's going to be more GPUs. There's just going to be more capacity from a supply standpoint as we speak. So we're not going to be in this world of highly expensive inference costs over time. But the combination of what Ganesh indicated, which is the more highly compressed models that you need less GPU compute, particularly on the inference side, plus the fact that we're going to see the cost of inference come down quite dramatically over the next 2 to 3 years, we think that there will be plenty of opportunity to build smaller, cheaper, faster, better models at scale.
Super interesting. And I think when I think about that point, kind of the fact that you will have business models that will kind of operate at much lower cost than where they are today long term, and what you were speaking to before as it relates to the opportunity to leverage generative AI internally, there was one question in the chat that I thought was quite relevant, which kind of went to Ganesh, your earlier point when you spoke about the impact on legacy application code. And the question asked whether or not generative AI should and will be kind of used to automate the recoding of apps, to retire technical debt and mesh with modern kind of app builds to automate industry. And so curious how you think about, legacy players and the opportunity to leverage generative AI and where they have mass kind of technical debt.
Yeah. So even before generative AI, that was true. Okay. Because if you think about some of the largest enterprise application vendors that are out there, those architectures are 2-3 decades old. Mm-hmm. And you could argue that they have never been reimagined. They've only been re-implemented from old mainframe to client server to distributed web to pseudo web to internet to SaaS, they're still the same simple database CRUD process automation applications. Even to this day, some of these biggest applications don't have the notion of data as a first-class citizen or analytics as a first-class citizen. So even before generative AI, that was actually true, right? And what's happened is, we've seen the emergence of the modern data stack. We've seen the emergence of the new MLOps, industrialization of the MLOps stack, but they've kind of evolved independent from the application development stacks. Because people have, we still haven't reached the level of sophistication where you can embed them. Like every generation of embedded analytics kind of hit a wall. Whereas I think with generative AI, especially, it is just a forcing function. It is not the primary enabler. It's a forcing function where when people try to get to eventual outcomes of a generative application, which is, I am trying to not just automate, repetitive, mundane tasks in the enterprise. I'm actually going after creative work. I'm actually going after productivity. You have to start surrounding and looking at the other applications. And I do think we will see application stacks that emerge where AI as a first-class citizen and also generative AI as a first-class citizen will happen. And when that happens, you have to start building these applications. And you have to also think about that many of these applications were built on the earlier versions of what we would now call low-code platforms. Every one of these big enterprise application vendors built their own internal low-code platforms, which they may still do, but they will now be driven off of a completely different idea of application definition and engineering and end-to-end productivity in those systems. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons this is super exciting is the combination of the technology breakthroughs, the state of the market, could actually mean that we're headed to a large-scale replacement market in many of these applications because we've only surrounded them with other systems of intelligence.
Yeah, when you think about where software development encompassed some amount of like a declarative language, it involved a significant set of rules being encoded in a rules engine.
Mm-hmm.
And anything you had to catch in between had a tremendous amount of fuzzy logic. Right, all of that just goes away.
Yep.
Right, all of that is now going to be powered with a generative model at scale, and that profound change we have not even fully understood what it's going to look like, and it's going to happen, faster than we're thinking. But in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see a very different context for most software companies because of what we're seeing right now.
And I guess with that, clearly, generative AI is going to, there's so much opportunity as it relates to building and the value that will be created by generative AI. And so switching a little bit to a different area, which is talent, a lot of the talent, as you spoke to Ganesh earlier, are researchers and researchers becoming operators. So how do you think about kind of the challenges that researchers will face as they transition from that role into being an entrepreneur, and kind of where do you see the broader state of tech talent within generative AI and the kind of the biggest restrictions that there may be?
See, every week we're seeing breakthroughs, in fact, every day, that lowers the barrier to actually building and using these large foundation models already. And yes, like I talked about, it is very important. We've actually seen the other way, people who are not deep generative AI researchers who actually understand a unique opportunity or a customer problem, be able to look at generative AI as just another way of applying, just another programming model or an extension or technology, actually do fairly well, being able to incorporate. That's why we're excited about all of the portfolio companies in our that are attempting to do this and incorporating generative AI as a add-on capability. But there's also a talent gap in companies that are building these tooling, trying to take it to market to large, say global 5,000. Because most enterprises are struggling with what does it mean to actually deploy generative AI. So we do believe there's going to be some of the large foundation models or people that are trying to tackle big problems will have to build some services capabilities initially because their customers are not going to be able to catch these tools and actually be able to build them. You have to meet where your customers where they are, so you have to build these services capabilities yourself.
Yeah, and in that regard, if you think about the talent situation, the creation of some of these next generation foundation models like GPT-4 and the entire class of competitors that are surrounding, where a trillion parameter large language model would emerge, and several of them are coming beyond just OpenAI's GPT-4. That level of talent is very much segmented to maybe 5 to 10 builders, right? Companies that are focused on the LLMs, and they are going to do tremendously well by just kind of focusing on the research that's involved there. The other point of the talent, which I think both Jenna and Ganesh you alluded to, which is like, okay, for the rest of everybody, right? The 99% of the folks who are not in the large language model building space, like how does the talent emerge? In a lot of ways, I think it lowers the bar, and in a good way. I think it enables more democratization and more capabilities from a broader set of folks to participate in how the next generation of software emerges. I think what's a little bit different though is that we haven't fully baked the capabilities we're talking about into the developer toolkit, right? And I think Ganesh alluded to this. Right now, it still kind of sits alongside of data engineering and data science and machine learning practitioners that I described, the stack or the hyperstacks that are associated with them, but it hasn't necessarily gone straight into how a developer works and the DevOps tooling that's emerged. And I think that's the next opportunity where this just becomes mainstream and just part of how software development occurs on a day in, day out basis. Copilot's probably the closest example, but I think there's more coming than just a generative tool for co-piloting how code gets built.
And to add to it, Jenna, when we meet with entrepreneurs that have come out of a research background, we kind of ask them who do they have advising them? Because great entrepreneurs have great advisors, and many times these advisors have been through the journey of creating something from scratch and taking it to market, and also have the know-how of various categories or building great teams. So are they surrounding themselves with other? Sometimes we find it, our field of software development has become so hyper specialized in and of itself. A deep ML researcher actually doesn't know how to build a app with basic software engineering principles. So we're looking for teams that complement each other, that have that full experience of not just deep experience in LLMs or foundation models or machine learning or industrializing it, but also building good software around them and taking them to scale.
One example of that, interestingly, you mentioned this, was OpenAI itself.
Yeah.
If you think about where OpenAI really started to create a level of differentiation for themselves, they took the team that was working on research and ensured that the team that were software developers,
they were the first one to make that
were
pivot.
really brought together,
Yeah.
right? And I think that is a good template for any company, any software provider in their respective category, to think about not keeping the researchers separated from the product developers.
Yeah. Well, I know we could speak about this kind of topic for days. I'm cognizant of time, but there's one question that came from the attendees that I think is a good way to wrap it up. Both of you speak to entrepreneurs that are reinventing categories on a daily basis. And so what advice would you have for them as it relates to weighing whether they should be thinking about generative AI as a way to create internal efficiency versus as a feature or value proposition for customers and SaaS? If they are the buyers of generative AI tools, like what part is more, where is there more value to be kind of benefit from?
What I try to tell any founder that I spend time with today is make sure you understand the persona and the needs around that persona before you start to go down this pathway of building a generative application. I think the tools folks have a different opportunity, and for the tools folks, they're looking at the quality of that build chain and being able to provide additional value to how that current quality of the build chain exists today. But for a pure application provider, they really should understand the persona and how it changes remarkably. So my view over time is like, this is not going to be a single or a few LLMs that drive the sort of value creation of the space. It's literally going to be 1,000 LLMs that are going to be supportive of the 1,000 different personas that are in the software category market today. I think what I would tell any founder today, whether they came from research or whether they came from, you know, another software company and they're profoundly interested in starting something at this moment, is be prepared for a rapid amount of iteration and change. And so what you start your journey with is certainly not going to be where things are going to end up, because things are literally changing on a week-to-week basis. But I think I try to zoom out a little bit further and look at this in a 5 to 10 year horizon. And I would say to anyone who's asked me the question, look, it was only a month ago that the most important object that's been created, the most important artifact that's been created in human civilization arrived, and that was GPT-4. And now what we do with it and all the derivatives that emerge from it has opened a tremendous possibility. So people ask me sometimes now where the TAM of all this is. Well, at the very least, this is all of software, but I almost imagine this being all of humanity. Yep. And I think that's where, you know, we should be okay with a lot of just thrashing, just be honest, in the next, you know, year or so. But as things settle down, I think there's some profound opportunity for any investor as well as any entrepreneur to build insanely great things for at least the next decade.
Yeah, I would, you know, I would add for any entrepreneur at this time, it's an exciting time, right? But it's also in some ways similar to the past, when every time you start, any entrepreneur starts a journey, there's plenty of choices of technology stacks that you can go make. So what we really look for and what we advise is, are they customer obsessed? And do they have customer empathy? Can they look into the problem and create a unique point of view that actually working backwards helps them choose? They may start with, you know, 3 stitched together LLMs today and end up with a completely different set of solutions, you know, 3 months from now. But if they have that right customer empathy and customer obsession, applying these technologies could become really, really interesting. And also, like George mentioned, it opens up every category. Like in the last decade, software has become everything. Software is no longer just a category, it's almost every industry. And this is pretty much all of work. So there's going to be a lot of disruption.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great way to wrap it up. As everyone can see, George, Ganesh, and I are very excited about builders that are, you know, in this category and shifting how things operate given this new innovation. And so please feel free to reach out to any of us, as we'd love to speak. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Deanna, who will wrap it up. But thank you both, George and Ganesh, for sharing your perspective. It was valuable. And thank you all for coming.